the moment of death is the last opportunity to get enlightened with friends. So like if you're lucky, right before you're standing alone, it's like you have that last send off of people who are like, you've got it.
Now, I suppose all of your life experience has been culminating together for this work you're doing now.
Like moving at the speed of trust. It's like, I feel like that's how this thing has to grow.
Welcome to Stand in the Circle with me, Dr. Rosalind Watts.
This is the third episode of our month of Standing in the Circle with Cancer. My first guest is Katherine MacLean, a psychedelic researcher who made an early and really important discovery about how psychedelics can increase the personality trait of openness. And Katherine then left academia after her sister's death from cancer to be a mum and to write her wonderful book, Midnight Water, and to volunteer in hospice care and to create a sanctuary in the middle of a forest. You're one of the first women to be working in psychedelic science, and you made some amazing discoveries that we still work with today.
And I remember Roland handing me a data set from the first couple studies that had been run. And he said, you studied all of these variables with meditators. And the one thing we didn't seem to find were changes in core personality. And, just kind of, that, but just see if there's something we missed. And so I used all of the statistical analysis that I had been trained with and the kind of eye for these bigger patterns and how to find subgroups of people who were maybe changing within the data set, even if the data set looked like it hadn't changed very much. And he was right. Almost nothing changed except this one domain of personality, which is openness. And it was a huge change. It was such a huge change that I couldn't find any other research that had shown people could change in that way. Certainly not from a single day in their life, not a single chemical they took. Maybe like, a death in the family or a huge like divorce. Some big life event can change people's personality, but usually in a negative way. Like they become more neurotic, more anxious, more depressed. Nobody had really shown that people could become more creative, more open, more inspired by the world, more connected with nature. It's almost funny to say that because now there's so much research showing that psychedelics do this. It's been very validating to see that the result continued. And in particular, it was the people who had what we called at the time a mystical experience. And even that term has had a little bit of backlash, I think, over the years as psilocybin has become medicalized. But at the time, we weren't trying to cure anything. We weren't trying to treat any condition. We were just studying the human being as a system, within their community. And the mystical experience, this spirit of oneness, of connection with all that is very positive. It's unitive, it's dissolving. Most people have not had an experience like that in the regular population unless they've taken psychedelics or something like that. So the people who had that experience in response to psilocybin were the ones who increased in openness, and the increase stayed high for up to a year after the session. And then Roland and his team had also shown all these other benefits to having a mystical experience. So whether you argue about what it is, whether it's real, it predicts so many good outcomes. And I think now people are starting to kind of tease that apart, like what things does mystical experience predict and what doesn't it predict? But in some studies, it predicts outcomes that we care about, like recovering from depression, having less anxiety if you're a terminal patient. So it was exciting. And I remember writing up the paper and submitting it to the top psychology journal that I knew of at the time, where my previous meditation paper had been accepted. And the editor wouldn't even send it out for review. It was like, I'm not even going to give this consideration because this is impossible. Like what you're proposing is not possible. There's no precedent for this in the literature. So I'm not even going to let anyone review it. I was shocked. I was like, how could you just disregard this data set that is new? And I remember going to Roland and saying like, I feel so bummed because I really wanted a psychology paper, not a drug abuse paper. And he said, I know, but it's still so new for people. You just kind of have to go with some of the journals where people already know how good the work is that we do, who will give it a chance. And so we sent it to was it Journal of Psychopharmacology or Psychopharmacology? There were kind of two journals at the time that were kind of the solid ones. And the reviews were really positive. It became one of the most widely read papers of that year. It's still cited thousands of times. So it made a huge splash. And the hard work after that was I learned to be a guide. I had no clinical training, but I got to learn from Mary Cosimano and Bill Richards, who are like, they've guided hundreds, if not, 1,000 sessions, if you count the early days when Bill was at Spring Grove. I got to be thrown into the deep end of very deep clinical work. But
so you were doing this amazing work. The world was really watching. I mean, the psychedelic world was very small still at that time, but the field was very much kind of all eyes on Hopkins, what's happening. So you were very much at the crest of a wave. But then your sister Rebecca had a diagnosis of breast cancer, and this is where things really started to change for you.
Yeah.
Can you tell us about that time, what it was like when you heard the news, and tell us about Rebecca, who she was?
She worked very high up in Subway Corporation, which was like, making sandwiches. It's one of the most simple possible ideas, but she got to train people who'd never owned their own business before, people who didn't believe that they could do it because maybe they only had a high school education. She had this natural ability to connect people, to make them feel really good about themselves. She was so smart, so talented, so beautiful, but she always kind of like reflected that back to people in a way that made them come away from the experience feeling really good about themselves. So she was widely loved. She was hugely successful. When she was diagnosed, she had a 1-year-old daughter. She was trying to get pregnant with her second child. Looking back, it was likely all of the estrogen in her body that kind of triggered this genetic mutation to kind of go haywire. And I remember I had just started at Hopkins when she got the diagnosis. And within that first year of being at Hopkins, I had to go for genetic counseling to find out if I too had this 50-50 coin flip of a chance. And I remember talking to Roland before the genetic counseling, and he was like, "Are you really sure you want to know this?" I said, "I have to know it." Like, I just knew I had to know where my life was going, this branching path. And that if I didn't have it, it was one set of options. And if I did, it was a different set. And, the coin flip meant that I didn't have it. And she went in and got her surgery at 25 and a half, 26 years old, did all of the radiation, and was, quote, cured. And so life kind of went back to normal for a while. But there's this process that I'm now recognizing where a big life event in the future starts kind of rippling back and affecting you. And you kind of don't know where you're moving toward, that center of gravity. But it felt like the immensity of what we were going to face together was already affecting me. I was sitting with people having these profound experiences that changed their whole life path, changed their relationships. We were having cancer patients come in for their own study. I was seeing their lives change, people who had had given up hope that, like, I have this terminal diagnosis. I don't know if I have a few months or a few years, but it doesn't matter. Life isn't worth living. I just have to live with this grim reaper over my shoulder. Then they have their psilocybin experience, and suddenly it's like, even if I had a week left, it's worth it. I have so many people in my life I want to spend time with. I want to go in my garden. I want to take bike rides. The pain isn't so bad, so I can, go for walks. So it was all like the macro was the micro. What was happening in the world was also happening in my life. And being with her in the hospital, watching someone who is young, does not look sick, has a whole life ahead of her, not have a choice. I couldn't help but ask, like, when do I make that big leap? When do I make the choice that I would make if I had no time left? My initiation into being with death was really profound and beautiful. And then there are these flashes of remembering crying on the way to work, not thinking I could show up and do my job, missing her so terribly and not knowing how to go forward without the person who'd been with me my whole life. And somehow it was like those things were right next to each other. And I think the good thing about time is that I now remember the really good moments, and the difficult ones have kind of been like put into the compost heap of life. Like they've been churned up and used, and they've gone back into the cycle of things. And what remains is just this like unshakable faith in like that good things are possible even in the midst of something really tragic. And it sounds so corny to say that, but it's really true. And it's like life keeps kind of giving me those chances. So um Rebecca was the kind of person who nobody wants to lose, which sounds like such a strange thing. Like, of course, no one wants to lose someone, but she was such a grand figure in so many people's lives, both in her personal life and professional life. Um, and nothing about it made sense. It wasn't a right death. It wasn't, you couldn't make it okay. So I had to kind of sit with the fact that people die for no good reason who could have changed the world. Um, and I also think that over time, I've learned that like putting her death on a pedestal was also not the right thing to do. Like she's just a person. Many people die, many people impact the world. So it's been complex.
Mm.
Um, the thing I do want to say now is like her daughter is turning 18 and graduating high school and going to college. And she's also exceptionally talented. She's an actress. She does musical theater. She's so kind, and she's so sure of herself. And I get to see my sister in her. Like she is her own person, but I get to see my sister's legacy growing up. And it's amazing. It's what my sister wanted, was for Anya to have this amazing life. So that's inspiring as a mother, that like we can make our mistakes. We can kind of run into, situations that maybe we would have changed. But, what's coming, the next generation gets to do it their way.
Mm.
And they carry a big part of us with them.
Mm. It's beautiful to hear you talk about her daughter, Anya. And I guess it's so many years since we last spoke about Rebecca. And I can see how much things have shifted in this time and your understanding of it. And through the process of from her death to now, if you were to look at that kind of long process, where in the process did you start to be able to feel that sense of joy and that sense of appreciation rather than the deep grief? I suppose how did that unfold for you?
Yeah, wow. I was actually talking to someone recently about this. A good friend of mine, her husband died, but he died like he was an elder already. He was a meditator. He had this beautiful death, very intentional. And I said to her, I remember how I felt in those first 6 months. It was like being on a chemical, being enhanced in a way that felt like everything was open to me, all of the feelings. There was almost no boundary between me and the world. And then I remember after those 6 months, the grief like sucked me down. And it was good because I was like back on earth, but then it was like I kind of had to go into the underworld. And I want to tell people that that wasn't that long, but it was a long time. My trip into the underworld, it was kind of like intermixed with these other moments. I gave birth for the first time. Then the second time, we said goodbye to my father-in-law and then my dad, which we can talk about more. But like the underworld wasn't another place. It was just like another layer that was being navigated while life was happening. And I found people in that underworld space who understood, who maybe I wouldn't necessarily be like good friends with in the regular plane of life, but who understood that territory. I had a great somatic therapist, and just being a mom, my life got really simple. And then I would say it was probably year 8 or 9 after my sister died that the anniversary came around. It was in January, and it was no longer the hardest day. And then it was like after 10 years, I celebrated 10 years by going to Jamaica by myself and putting myself into this like beautiful healing water, and just reconnecting with all of those memories. And I was like, okay, I'm ready. Like, I'm ready for this next chapter of my life. And so 10 years feels like a long time, but really it's just like another season.
Hmm.
And I can't say that things just suddenly got easy after that. But that was kind of the turning point, I would say.
And now I suppose all of your life experience has been culminating together for this work you're doing now, which is on this amazing land with amazing trees, and talking about a safe space, being able to offer this to people when they really need it. So tell us a bit about what being
Yeah.
ground is.
So it's kind of wild. The first year after my sister died, the name of my book and the name of this land came to me. They were not my ideas. The book was very clearly about helping people understand trauma. I didn't really have the language for it at the time, but it was like Midnight Water. This is the journey through this dark space, and you're going to write about it. You got to live it first, but then you're going to write about it. And the place you're going to end up is the being ground, this green, luscious, like Eden, but an Eden that's real, like not some fantasy, not some faraway place. Like you're gonna make real the thing that you've always wanted, that is your safe space, and it could be that for others. Um, and the message was that both the book and the land would help people die, like not hasten death, but like help people get more okay with death, not just physical death, but kind of like death of an old self, death of ideas, death of other people's opinions. And so our land, we have about 15, 20 acres of open space, 100 acres of forest. It's surrounded by other forest that's privately owned. So as far as the eye can see, it's green. Right now it's green. Most of the year it's white snow. It is very cold here. But man, as soon as June comes around, it's just 4 straight months of just glorious beauty. I take it for granted, but like when people come here from the city, they're just like, oh my gosh, there's so much nature. And it is what humans used to have more of. And when I was in Baltimore, the city really hurt my nervous system. It was very hard to be in a city. And that was probably more of the decision than anything, is like I couldn't be in a city anymore and feel everything I was feeling. So being around trees helps me feel less of the human stuff and more of the beyond human, the plants, the microbes, the mushrooms, the birds, like all of it. Like that frequency is very healing for my nervous system. So just last year, we moved here 4 years ago. And then last summer, 2025, when so much is happening on the global scale, on the American political scale, and I did a personal ceremony on Imbolc Day, so Bridget's Day, February 1st. And she showed me the being ground. She showed me this beautiful like village with people and structures and gardens. And she said, you have to do this now. You can't wait, because the powers that be are not waiting. Like what is being proposed that is life destroying is not waiting. So you have to do this thing right now to affirm life. And I was like, okay, like it inspired me so much. So we built a yurt. It took this huge effort. My husband and my best friend's husband built the deck and got all the materials. Then this woman came and, instructed us through 10 hours. There were like all these people, friends of ours, family, who came together for one day. And we like rose this yurt, like a barn raising. And so it has the imprint of all of the community in it. And the energy in that space, the wood, the materials, just the place it is on the land, it feels like it's now a repository of all that good intention, but it's also not anyone's religion. It's not anyone's like, here are the rules. Before you come in the yurt, you have to do these 3 things, you know? You don't have to join my spiritual beliefs to enter the yurt. It's really a space for people to reconnect with themselves, and ideally something beyond themselves. So yeah, it's so exciting. The yurt is something I've dreamt about since, my daughter was born, a decade ago. The very beginning of all this, when we were at Africa Burn, we created this little tent called a womb with a view, because it had like a little flap in the tent, but it was also like inside the bigger space. It was like the extra safe space. So I see the yurt as like the womb on the land, that the land itself is supportive, but then there's also the extra safe space if you really just need a circle. And so when you asked me about this podcast, I was like, oh, I know about standing in the circle. I know about this. Like, it's so powerful, and humans used to do it all the time.
Mm. And you have this circle within a circle, this yurt within a forest, and being ground is for who? So who can come, and how? What's the vision of who this space is for?
In Vermont, we have medical aid in dying, which is legal. You can have a doctor prescribe a medicine that hastens death. You die within a few hours. And so people come here to do that. So someone has died in the yurt already, and it was a very beautiful day. This person got to be with their family, listen to music, say the prayers they wanted to say. This person was an atheist, but the family really needed to say certain prayers. I want it to be a space for kids who didn't get as much outside time. When they start to become adults and maybe say, I'm 18, I don't know what I want to do, they could come here and camp for 2 nights on the land and have their own, vision quest. So it's like little seeds. And for now, it feels really slow. Like it's like, a few people here, one person here, one child there. But eventually it has to, I think, there was a phrase that I think Mary Cosimano was the one who taught me. It was like moving at the speed of trust. And it's like, I feel like that's how this thing has to grow. It has to be at the speed of trust so that I feel safe here, that people feel safe when they come, and it doesn't become distorted into, what's like the worst thing it could be? Like an evangelical, charismatic church that suddenly there are all these rules and you have to follow them. And like, you have to give up all your life savings to come and be blessed at the yurt, like these ridiculous things that people do, how power changes people. So just like me staying humble and asking the land and trusting that what's here is enough. It can be simple.
It's lovely to think back as well to your earlier work and think about so many of the themes around being a psychedelic guide, around giving people that sense of trust and presence and safety and the importance of that, but also how when people have that, this openness can happen. So when I'm imagining your yurt space, it feels like a very safe space, but a real open space, a place for people to feel that shift without needing psychedelics, that shift can happen when we're in a truly, and that nature can really help and the trees can really help. Mm-hmm. So I was going to ask about, because this podcast is called Stand in the Circle, and it's about the 3 levels of standing in the circle with yourself, with others, and with the living world. So if you think about those 3 aspects or 3 levels through your life, which of those have been most important? Self, community, nature? Has it changed through your life? And where you are now, like what feels, maybe it's all of them.
Yeah. Certainly when I was young, it was nature. Nature was the space where I could feel safe. So the forest really protected me. I was just too sensitive, I think, at that time in my life. I still am, to understand why people do the things that they do. And so the forest was the retreat away from the human world that was like hard to understand for me. The circle of community, I think, was paramount in my 20s and 30s when I was like deep in the psychedelic work and really trying to create community. And I guess that makes me want to bring up the hospice work. So while I've been here, I've been training as a volunteer in hospice and after death care. And what I'm finding there is also the community that I've always wanted in my life. The people who will show up at an inconvenient moment, when you need to sit bedside vigil, or when a family needs help with shrouding a body and transporting the body to a grave site. And the people who show up to do that work are really unique. They're not ordinary, and they're not psychedelic either. It's interesting. It's a different kind of weird and good. But I feel like the hospice work is showing me that even if people haven't gotten that chance, everyone gets that chance at the end. I really believe that. And, I had a friend in the psychedelic world, Dee Goldpaw, who has a book that came out last year. And I remember she said, the moment of death is the last opportunity to get enlightened with friends. So like if you're lucky, right before you're standing alone, it's like you have that last send off of people who are like, you've got it. And so now I think I'm finally coming around to self. I think people need more alone time. but not the alone time that people are getting now, which is a lonely time, which is alone with your phone, alone with the internet, alone with TV, alone with your work. At the end of the line, it's you confronting you. And you have to be at peace with yourself, because if people don't show up, if people aren't doing the right thing, you still have to be okay in your own circle. And so that for me is like the next horizon. I would say that the self for me was not a safe space for a long time because of things that happened to me when I didn't have choice and control. And so now I can kind of reacquaint myself with who I am and not have it just be like living into a past that I no longer really feel connected with. And so it's like, of course, I'm 45. This is the opportunity, right? Is to like center myself.
And I love the full circleness of where you're coming to. And if you imagine Rebecca seeing this life path for you, what would she say if she could see where you are now?
Oh, yeah. And she'd be so proud. The vision that she gave me as she was dying was the essence of this. But it's like she didn't have access until she was right on the edge. It's like her own life didn't allow her to see beyond what she felt was her comfort zone. And so I think I've always kind of lived beyond her comfort zone, but now it's with her new perspective, it would, she'd be like, oh, she did it.
If you think back to the hardest moment for you through all of the mountains, the valleys of your life experience, if you think about the hardest time, what do you wish that somebody had said to you in that moment? What would you say to someone else who is in that deep, dark, hopeless place now?
Yeah. So for me, the hardest times have been when I was in really intense physical pain. I experience everything through my body. And what I found in those moments, that no one could tell me this pain is not dangerous. There were all these other things people were telling me, but no one was just acknowledging the pain and saying, it's real, it hurts, it's unbearable, and it's not dangerous. And it's a mantra I've actually been working with in the last year. And luckily pain comes and goes, so I get to practice it a lot, like the breath. But it's hard to believe when it's just yourself telling you. And so that's now kind of what I hope to tell others. It can be hard to say that without diminishing what someone's going through, because they can be like, how do you know it's not dangerous? What if it kills me? And to accept that even if something has the potential to kill you, it cannot be dangerous. Like, it's a really hard concept that I don't know that I would have been open to earlier on, but like that's kind of where I've come to now, is learning that emotions, sensations, anything I can feel and experience is safe.
And it feels like there's a real parallel there with psychedelic work. So in a psychedelic experience, you can feel like you're dying, or you're having a heart attack, or you're going through something really painful, and the guide will say, you might feel like you're dying, but you're not. It's okay to feel it. If you're going to die, feel that death. And that something about that messaging around it being safe to fully experience the emotions, because it is just emotions, it is just sensations, something about that. Being important for us to remember in our daily lives, regardless of whether we're taking psychedelics or not, just that it's safe to feel. And maybe that links as well with our solo time in the yurts of our lives, and what's so hard about that. And often it is being confronted with all these emotions when we're not numbing or looking at things, the intensity of emotional pain that can sometimes come, but also knowing that too is also safe. And that we're not alone in it, even when we stand solo, that we're held by other people. Katherine, thank you. How can people find the Being Ground?
So if you go to my regular website, which is katherinemaclean.org, there's a little tab at the top that says Being Ground. You'll see little like squares that say like help plant the orchard or give people a ceremony in the yurt. I think, that's also a way people can feel connected. Even if they don't need it, they can give to other people who might need it, which allows us, this was really important for me. This may change at some point, but for now, I can offer what we have for free. And if I get donations, then I can offer things for free and really not feel torn about it. But I don't want money to be an obstacle for people accessing this kind of sanctuary. So,
well, thank you so much. It sounds like a really beautiful, beautiful project, and I hope it grows and grows in the right, slow, gentle, organic pace.
yes.
And I can't wait to see it one day. Mwah! Thank you, Katherine.
Thank you, Roz.
My next guest, Yvan Beaussant, is a palliative care physician at Dana-Farber Cancer Institute in Boston, which is a Harvard-affiliated hospital running psychedelic trials with people facing serious illness. His first participant was the first person dosed with psilocybin in a Harvard hospital in around 60 years. And here's part of my conversation with him. I asked him about psychedelic research happening for cancer carers because last week Kim from ASA mentioned taking part in a trial and how much it helped. I also asked Yvan to give us an overview of the research looking at psychedelic therapy as an intervention to treat demoralization, anxiety, and depression in people with cancer. I asked him to share some insights from his work and to give people some pointers about what they can do if they're interested and want to learn more.
So the research at the intersection between palliative care or serious illness care, cancer care, and psychedelic-assisted therapy has started very early in the history of psychedelic research. Back then in the early 1960s and 1970s, in the pre-prohibition era, was like a very active research, mostly internationally and in the US, mostly in two centers, at the Spring Grove Hospital and at Chicago University. Researchers then were looking at how psychedelic-assisted therapy, mainly LSD and DPT for dimethyltryptamine, where they were looking at composite measures of quality of life or death anxiety, well-being, and how psychedelic-assisted therapy might help patients dealing with the suffering associated with end of life and serious illness. And the Chicago team was more focusing on pain. And so really those teams set the stage and did a lot of early findings around the idea of set and setting in psychedelic-assisted therapy and how the mindset of participants influence the kind of experience they have and the importance of the environment, trust, and in which the experience happens. And then, after the early 70s, the Controlled Substance Act, nothing much has happened until the early 2000s, where universities first at UCLA with Charlie Grubb, and then Johns Hopkins University and New York University were able to put together like some small pilot trial with more modern research methods, like randomized control trial. And they looked at more discrete measures of psychological and existential distress, like anxiety and depression or demoralization. And these trials found remarkable results, so they were controlled, and like people who received the active investigational drug, which was psilocybin then, really did much better in terms of like improvements of outcomes than the control groups. And so I think this really contributed to the renaissance in which we are now, like then the FDA and authorities decided to bring these investigational interventions to the more general public with a major depressive disorder. And but the research in cancer patients is still very active, and now is looking increasingly at how to integrate psychedelic-assisted therapy, in particular psilocybin, MDMA, or ketamine, within existing models of serious illness care. So and who are the patients who may benefit, for which indications, how do we measure change and improvement, how do we measure safety? So all of these are the questions that are being investigated currently by the research. There are some significant trials that are currently ongoing, with multi-site trials trying to consolidate, confirm those results from smaller trials in larger populations. So there are several multi-site trials currently ongoing, looking at depression, anxiety, demoralization. There is one that we're participating in that is specifically looking at the safety of psilocybin and LSD therapy in older adults populations, in preparation of looking at the potential benefits for chronic pain. To your question for caregivers and family caregivers, I think we have seen some early trials conducted, in one conducted in Maryland in dyads where one patient has cancer and adjustment disorder, and the other participant is a significant other of the same participant, and they both receive MDMA assisted therapy in the context of adjustment disorder. So that's really interesting how much relationship is at the core of their therapeutic process, and really highlighting how the experience of suffering in the context of cancer is dynamic and happens within a system, around the patient.
So my other question is, so in your work, with your own work, the trial that you've been working on with people approaching serious illness, serious cancer, and having a psychedelic experience, in terms of connectedness, because that's this podcast is really about connectedness, what kind of things do you see in terms of shifts in connectedness, just generally when you work with this kind of population of people, thinking about connection to self, connection to others, and connection to nature and connection to spirituality? What kind of things have you seen?
I love that question. I think this is really at the core of what drives changes, and therapeutic benefits in psychedelic assisted therapy. This people really develops new ways to connect to self, others, nature, and spirituality. Whether this happens, at the experiential, subjective level, or at a more neurobiological level, and it's probably both. But we do see, in terms of the connection to self, people will relate to themselves differently, and we see a lot of people developing acceptance, to self, lots of self-forgiveness, learning to be more compassionate about themselves, and also looking at themselves, this idea of self-transcendence, is there's what's happening to them, but they also can see that from a different angle or perspective. And relationship is, very often impacted. So connection to others, people develop both more empathy to others, but also different ways to look at boundaries, when they're entangled in relationships and feel very how do you say that, feel impacted, but there's something is something that can allow them to develop both more empathy towards other, but also more healthier boundaries sometimes in certain relationships, and forgiving to others, and kind of being more centered in the here and now in relationship. Many of my patients, have talked about impact in how they relate to nature and how they feel more related to nature, um, and describe, like in some ways, more ability to connect to what's beyond us, right, or beyond them as individuals, and what's greater than us. Um, and just maybe one example that comes to mind, in one of the trial we conducted with psilocybin-assisted therapy in patients with at the end of life who receive hospice care in the context of existential distress. We treated this young mother of 47 who was dying of a pulmonary disease. And during her experience with psilocybin, she described afterwards like a sense of really peeling multiple layers of her grief and her guilt, getting to ultimately to the core biological fact of her illness, and that had nothing to do with her in a sense, and so she was able to let go of her grief and guilt. And zooming out, she was then seeing like all beings, including herself, as coming from and going back to a sort of cosmic primordial river. So that was her experience, but in the after, in the month that she had to live, this experience really allowed her to, I think, in a sense, forgive herself of leaving her family and two young teenage daughters, um, and just feeling that getting free of the guilt, right? And this allowed her to be so much more present to her daughters and her family in her last month, which was really impactful for all of her family, and finding spiritual comfort. So yeah, I think that example, like just tells about like how all those three layers were impacted for this person.
Thank you so much for that example. And I was just thinking about how when somebody is coming into a psychedelic experience, I mean, they're kind of challenging enough as it is, and they need a solid container anyway. But when somebody is coming in with this other layer of severe illness, with the physical challenges, maybe pain, and all the social factors around that, there are issues with family. And I was just wondering, what kind of container is required, thinking about before and during and after, for somebody with cancer or serious illness who is having a psychedelic experience? What kind of care is required to make it safe?
Yeah, thank you for that question. I think it's really something that is very close to our research. Is the recognition that people who experience cancer and their families, are really faced with multiple symptoms related both to the disease and to the treatment. All the burden of medical appointments, navigating the unknown, sense of isolation, like the mental health burden that goes with it, the existential suffering, and death anxiety. So it's a lot to deal with, like when you face a life-threatening illness like cancer. And so I think, like even before talking about what container, but in terms of container, like I think we're no, yeah. So even before mentioning a container, I think it's really important maybe to highlight that it's deep introspective work, that people are engaging into in psychedelic assisted therapy. That where we really see this as a combined psychological / behavioral intervention and like a pharmacological intervention. I think the first thing is for patients to want to do this work, right, of psychotherapy, deep introspective work, where instead of trying to counteract the suffering of cancer experience, like with finding solution and constant action that can be in serious illness care to find a solution to these problems. Here, one kind of like sees as a potential value in slowing down and allowing the self to process what's going on, and to be open to learning and growing into different kinds of perspective, right? So I think the first layer of the container is the self, right? Is like allowing oneself to engage in this kind of deep work, and that's not something that can be really prescribed for one, like it can be supported and accompanied, but one has to be willingly and engaging with that. And then, but then for it to be beneficial and supportive, I think it's really important that people have like a good social support, and like a sort of a stability in their life, that they're available, they can make space to do this kind of work, and also ideally do that with the support of their medical team, whether and even better if they can already be engaged in some sort of social support, in their cancer care, have met with a social worker or psychologist, and be in an active, relationship to kind of maximize their layers of support. And then, so I've really learned like the importance of those multiple layers, of the container, for the healing to be able to unfold, right, for patients. And I had, seeing this question, I have a quote that I love from one of our qualitative research, that really tells about this, from a patient who went through psilocybin-assisted therapy in the context of cancer and depression. And she says, to feel in these concentric circles of being so well cared by the therapist in the room with me, by the people who are part of that team, by my family and friends, by my oncologist. There were so many layers of it, so many layers of feeling well cared for, that were every bit as much part of the experience as confronting the painful reality of death, both in the physical pain and the psychological pain.
Wow, what a beautiful, beautiful quote. And really that idea of concentric circles is just absolutely at the heart of everything we talk about here, and how much those concentric circles are kind of needed by everybody. But I suppose they really come into their own when you're going through something really terrifying. That's when those concentric circles become so important.
Absolutely.
So my last question for you now is really around how people might be listening to this, and whether they have a cancer diagnosis themselves, or they know someone that has, or they're caring for someone that has, and they are wondering, it's all very well and good hearing about psychedelics, but how on earth do I go about even learning about this, exploring about this? What would you say are kind of some first steps for people to learn more? And obviously, could you tell us a little bit about, I know at the moment there's huge limitations of access because psychedelics are still controlled substances, but any tips for people in terms of finding clinical trials, or just starting to kind of dip a toe into these waters? What would you advise?
Yeah, that's a great question, and it's not an easy one, because for sure there's increasing awareness, in patients, families, in the population in general, around the potential benefits of psychedelic assisted therapy, and yet the legal access is still very challenging, and research, like it's mostly through research right now, and it's hard, to find research studies that people may qualify, and then to be screened in the studies. So we are at this period of time where there is increasing demand and recognition of the need, but not yet the evidence base, completely, or it's still really unfolding, and legal access for sure. And all of this depends on where people are located, which country, which state in the US, because the regulation is not the same. And to echo what I was saying a little bit earlier, I think like it's at least in my experience within research, we've really we're emphasizing the importance of the therapeutic process, in addition to receiving the psychedelic drug and the mind-altering, substance. Um, and even though this experience of non-ordinary state of consciousness may accelerate or deepen, one's therapeutic process, I think it remains really effective to the proportion of where people engage in the therapy aspect of it. So I think really this is one step that is really accessible, is to find the right support or the right context in which people feel safe to engage in self-reflection, slowing down the pace, finding space where they can process what's going on, for them, whether they are patients or family caregiver, and really just be with their experience, allow it to to come to awareness, and allow it to process and to learn and to grow. So I think that's always accessible, and it's to people who are on this path. And then, so increasingly, substances like ketamine, are more available than classic psychedelics, but increasingly are proposed in the context of psychedelic-assisted therapy. And ketamine has promising data that that indicate that this could help with psychological and existential distress in the context of cancer. In terms of clinical trials, it's looking at clinicaltrial.gov, and looking at in your area where if and where trials are happening, and then just keeping a close look at the regulation, reading about it, and maybe finding other people who are engaged, or interested in this. These are what comes to mind for now.
Thank you so much. Yeah, wise words. And if I can ask you one cheeky question with just a couple of minutes for you to answer it, if you want to, I'm just really curious about whether doing this, and no need to answer if you don't feel comfortable, but has doing this work, has it had an impact on your own spirituality?
Yeah, I would say yes. I mean, it depends how you define spirituality, and it's a big word, and but definitely, I'm like I learned personally, professionally by so much by our study research participants and their families in so many ways, that are that I learned deeply from, right? And so I feel very privileged and grateful for that. Yeah, I think one thing that I'm in terms of what actually happens, for people, and what I'm witnessing by my position as a principal investigator and sometimes a therapist, is like despite all the challenges related to cancer or serious illness and end of life that we've mentioned earlier. There's something through this work, that allows people to reposition themselves, like beyond the physical or emotional or mental self and all the suffering that happens in the context of serious illness and end of life, at those three levels of the body, all the emotional turmoil, the thoughts and thinking patterns that sometimes can be so limiting, but after this kind of work, people it's like find themselves a little bit more agency and latitude, to witness that, and allow it to exist and to happen, but also to do that with more acceptance and agency, with even when the body, heart, and the head are suffering. So instead of resisting or instead of self-criticizing, with all those ruminations, there is more space for appreciation being present to the here and now, taking care of themselves and their families, So it's really beautiful in some way to see that, and the learning for me is like, well, how, you know, I'm fortunate enough that I'm not facing this in my life at this point, but you know, but what can I learn from myself in that, right? It's like, so there's a lot of you know, I learn a lot from my patients and their families in that regard.
Thank you so much for your time and your work. It's been really great to hear from you. Thank you. So Katherine and Yvan both looking at how these powerful medicines of nature connection, community connection, and psychedelic therapy can all potentially offer shards of light when walking through the deepest valleys of cancer. And I do really encourage anyone who is seeking community around connectedness or around psychedelic therapy, have a look at what we're up to in ASA. We have free live events on our website. Come along. You don't need to say anything. You can just listen. And if you want, you can ask questions. There are links in the show notes. Next week is the last episode of our Cancer Month, and I'll be answering the questions that you've sent in. So if there's something this month has raised for you, or you have a question, there's still time. Please fill in the simple contact form. There's a link in the show notes. Thank you for being here. I'm Ros Watts. Stand in the circle.